In 1981, we witnessed the premiere of one of the most anticipated sequels of all time. The sequel to the smash hit known as Superman the Movie. This sequel, however, was not free of controversy. The news of the dismissal of Richard Donner, the director of the first film, did not leave anyone indifferent, especially considering that it was known that Donner had already filmed a good part of the sequel. Despite this, Richard Lester, director of multiple comedy films, such as the Beatles films A Hard Day's Night and Help, took the project and executed it in the way he considered correct. The sequel was eventually released and left many happy, however the doubt of what the film would have been like had it been finished by Donner was lingering in the minds of many fans at the time. Fast forward to 2006, fans finally managed to have an answer to this question. Warner Brothers gave director Richard Donner the opportunity to finalize his version of Superman 2 and release it to the public. In this video, we will take a look at all the situations surrounding the production of Superman 2: The Richard Donner Cut, from the conception of the first Superman film to the final release of the Donner Cut. In a distant 1970, the superhero products that existed at that time were functional but basic. We can highlight the 50s Superman series by George Reeves, Adam West's Batman from the 60s, among others. However, it is important to emphasize that the world of superheroes was related solely and exclusively to the world of TV, which usually implied that budgets were limited, which was fully demonstrated in the visual effects that these productions were capable of showing. The perfect example is Superman's flight scenes, which did not go beyond placing the character on a table and varying the background. Although these effects were functional, they did not allow much dynamism when showing the flight. This entire austere approach to superhero productions would change in 1973. Film producers Alexander Salkind, Ilya Salkind, and Pierre Spengler were finishing producing one of their films titled The Four Musketeers. It is in this context that it occurs to Ilya Salkind that it would be a good idea to make a film about one of the American icons par excellence, Superman. An idea that was supported by his father Alexander and by the film's future shareholders. Many things can be said about the Salkinds as producers. However, it is a fact that they decided to take the project with the economic and creative seriousness that was required to do justice to the character. This was demonstrated in the creative decisions after securing the rights to the character, such as the decision to bring in a renowned screenwriter, such as Mario Puzo, the writer of the book The Godfather, to write a first draft of the story of the film, a draft that would be so large that it would end up laying the foundations for a Superman Part 1 and Part 2. Other important creative decisions that demonstrated the seriousness of the project was the hiring of renowned actors who had a box office appeal, such as the case of Marlon Brando, who had just made The Godfather, or such as the case of Gene Hackman, an actor who had worked in films such as I Never Sang for My Father, The Poseidon Adventure, among others. All of these creative decisions would give weight to the production in the eyes of the press and the public, which would demonstrate that there was a serious intention to turn Superman into an intellectual property of renown and economic weight. We have talked about screenwriters and actors who gave shape and strength to the project. However, the basis where every film must stand is in the director. The Salkinds were clear about this, and that is why multiple renowned directors were approached with the offer to direct the two parts of Superman. Among these directors, we can name people like William Friedkin, director of The Exorcist, Peter Yates, among many others. However, the first director who was hired to direct was Guy Hamilton, director of several James Bond films. After Puzo delivered his novel version of what would be the script for the two parts of Superman, the Salkinds decided to approach Robert Benton, David Newman, and Leslie Newman to adapt this script into something cinematic. What would eventually emerge here would be a first draft of the films, a script that would be characterized by having a lot of humor, closer to what would eventually be Superman 3. In fact, David and Leslie Newman would end up writing Superman 3. So in that film, we can get an idea of what would have been Superman Part 1 and 2 if it had been entirely written and influenced by these screenwriters. Because yes, the script for Superman 1 and 2 would not remain in this state for long. The script was ready, multiple actors were hired, and director Guy Hamilton was ready to take the helm of the film. The plan was to start filming in Italy, however, coincidentally, due to a controversy linked to the film The Last Tango in Paris and Marlon Brando, it became impossible to film in this place, which is why the second most economical option was to make the film in England, more specifically in what is known as Pinewood Studios. However, Guy Hamilton at that very moment was beginning to no longer be considered resident in England, so he could not be in the filming sessions if they took place in this country. This became for the Salkins a decision between Guy Hamilton or Marlon Brando, and logically they chose Marlon since he had a very great box office appeal, in addition to being the crystal that allowed the film to obtain the necessary momentum for it to begin to be considered something serious. It is for this reason that the film was left without a director. One of Ilya Salkin's ex-wives ended up proposing director Richard Donner, who would eventually end up accepting the role of director. Richard Donner, director of films such as The Omen, was approached and eventually hired to direct Superman 1 and 2. Donner was a fan of the character, and upon reading the current script for the film, he felt that the character was being done a disservice by to place such low-quality humor in the film.
And had all this goofy, silly stuff like Superman flying down and tapping Telly Savalas on the shoulder. He turns around and he says, "Who do you love, baby?"
It is in this context that Donner decided to approach his faithful friend and colleague Tom Mankiewicz, so that together they could work on the film and honor the character's legacy. Donner's philosophy in accepting the job was that regardless of whether he accepted or not, the Salkins were going to do the project, and most likely they were not going to change the current tone and focus of the film, so he felt what he considered it the absurd necessity of keeping Superman clean and pure.
Honest to God, I mean, the idea of those guys making Superman the way they were going to do it, I had decided, and I talked Tom into it, that we've got to do this. This is American tradition, and we had to keep the history and the purity of the piece, what Siegel and Schuster originally started out to do.
It is in this context where Donner creates his mantra titled verisimilitude, a mantra that precisely seeks to ensure that in all filmmaking departments there is a sense of closeness and commitment to the project, to honor what the character is and what he represents. Donner was on board as director and Mankiewicz as creative consultant. This led to a new rewrite of the script, a version that would ultimately become the film we saw, at least for part 1. After Donner and Mankiewicz entered the project, the most important casts of the film, Superman and Lois Lane, remained to be chosen. It is in this context that Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder would end up being cast. To this we must add the addition of other important roles, such as Jackie Cooper as Perry White, Mark McClure as Jimmy Olsen, Terrence Stamp as Zod, among others. Principal photography began in March 1977, however, in an untraditional way for those times. The decision was made not to film Superman 1 first, and then Superman 2, but rather that they would be recorded simultaneously. Recent cases have been seen in this way of approximating the filming, such as the case of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The idea first was to finish all the content that involved Marlon Brando and Gene Hackman. They were busy actors, so they had to finish their scenes quickly. The other approach that would be carried out would be to finalize the filming sets. A practical example would be that it was decided to film all the content of the Daily Planet set for both films, the same with the scenes of the Fortress of Solitude, etc. This way of filming will be essential to understand why a Donner cut of Superman 2 exists. The filming of the Superman movies was complex to say the least. At first, this unusual way of filming seemed like a good idea from a creative point of view, since the continuity between both films would be unique. However, that would imply that the Salkinds were producing two high-budget films at the same time, without receiving income from either. To this we must add Donner's perfectionism when creating the film's special effects. Donner was disappointed when he saw the test material for the flight scenes, so he decided that a large part of the budget would go to this purpose. Eventually, a lot of technology would be invented so that Superman could fly, such as the case of Zoptic technology, which would end up giving the honorary Oscar for visual effects to its creator, Zoran Perisic. This hunger on Donner's part to ensure that all aspects of the film were perfect would end up bothering the producers a lot, since the budget was very high and continued to grow day by day, in addition to the fact that the filming dates were not being fully respected. All this would generate a quite tense atmosphere between the Salkinds and Donner, even being on the set exerting pressure. It is in this context where Richard Lester appears for the first time, who would act as an intermediary between Donner and the Salkinds. However, it must be understood that this was a rather uneasy situation, since everything seemed to indicate that Richard Lester was closer than far from taking the project, leaving out Donner. Despite everything, filming continued to a very specific point. Superman Part 1 was about 90% complete, and Superman Part 2 was about 70% complete. For the previously mentioned reasons of cost and time, the Salkinds asked Donner to stop production of Superman Part 2 so that resources could be redirected to finishing Superman Part 1. Donner accepted. It is in this context where the Salkinds and Warner Brothers asked Donner and Mankiewicz to change the ending of Superman 2 and Superman 1. Originally, Superman 2 was going to end with the time travel we saw in Superman 1. However, as it was the most spectacular effect in both films, it was requested that this ending be changed for Superman 1, as it was necessary to ensure that Superman 1 was a success. After everything that happened, Superman 1 was finished, the new ending was added, and everything was finalized. Things ended up cooling down. Superman 1 was a great success at the box office, in specialized critics, and in public perception. In fact, at the time, it was the biggest hit ever made by Warner Brothers. An interview was conducted by Variety with Pierre Spengler, where Spengler acknowledges that there was a lot of tension between the producers and Donner. However, they were willing to leave the past behind and concentrate on continuing to work together on the remaining 30% of Superman 2. Donner was also interviewed for this article, where he gave a much more aggressive and blunt response, mentioning that if Spengler was associated with the film, he would not be. This did not sit well with the producers, who made the final decision to fire Donner from the film. Donner finally received a telegram stating that his services were no longer required. This decision was extremely complex and controversial, not only from a sentimental angle among the cast brought by Donner to the film, but also from a logistical point of view. Donner was leaving, but leaving behind a film that was 70% complete. What would be the next step that the Salkinds would take? After Donner's departure, many people involved in the project began to leave the production of Superman 2. Here we can highlight Tom Mankiewicz, a personal friend of Richard Donner who was in fact brought to the project thanks to Donner, who, out of respect for his friend, decided to leave. Others who followed him were John Williams, Gene Hackman, etc. As mentioned in the introduction, Richard Lester took the reins of the project. This was not easy for a huge number of reasons. First of all, Lester, in order to obtain the sole director credit, had to own at least 51% of the footage that was in the film. For this reason, Lester not only had to finish the remaining 30% that Donner did not shoot, but also had to rewrite and reshoot material already filmed. This brings us to the second point. Marlon Brando, although he was the crystal that made the Superman 1 project emerge, he was extremely expensive, since Brando received a certain salary and also a high box office percentage. However, at this point, it was no longer necessary for him to be tied to the production. Superman was already a recognized franchise, and it was not necessary for a renowned actor to maintain the foundations of the project. For these reasons, it was decided to cut Brando's material for the second film, and it was decided to reshoot these scenes with Susanna York, who had played Superman's Kryptonian mother. Other reasons why Lester's adaptation to the production was complex was that the cast was extremely loyal to Donner. Here we can highlight Margot Kidder, who in fact obtained reductions in scenes for the third film for being so direct and public in her discontent over Donner's firing.
To say that, you're supposed to say we're exploring another character or whatever. They hurt my beloved Donner, and I made no bones about how I felt about it, and the repercussions were followed like the night to day. So I come in at the beginning and I say I'm going on vacation, hi Annette O'Toole, and I go off and I come back at the end, I guess, with a tan.
Also, Jack O'Halloran, actor of Non, who in fact had told the Salkinds that if Donner didn't come back, he wouldn't either. Also Terrence Stamp, actor of Zod and Along, etc. According to Stamp, the choice of Lester for the film was clearly made because he was an economical director who could keep things in order in terms of budget and time.
The Sorkins had chosen him because they knew that he was an economic director who could bring things in on budget.
Lester was not a fan of Superman. He was only there to carry out his job entrusted to him by the Salkinds. For Lester to be able to make the film his own, he had to bring in new talent. Here we can highlight Ken Thorne, the composer, who adapted Williams' soundtrack quite correctly. We can also highlight Peter Merton, the production designer, Robert Painter, director of photography, among many others. At the end of the day, the project was able to move forward. The film was released in 1981, and at the time it was well received by specialized critics and fans, which was reflected in a good box office. Not as good as the first movie, but good nonetheless. But it also received certain criticisms, such as the tone that was a bit far from what was established by the first film, or also the humor that was often not funny, etc. As mentioned in the introduction, the film was not free of controversy. All the information about Donner's dismissal and Lester's hiring was public, and there was knowledge of the existence of another version of Superman 2 that Donner had left unfinished. For this reason, many fans began to pressure for this version to be released. However, many factors worked against it. First of all, we are in the 80s. Communication was not as free and instantaneous as it is now. So achieving something like what it was seen with the Release the Snyder Cut movement of Justice League was materially impossible to achieve. Another conflict was that the Superman films were not made by a studio. They were films made privately by the Salkinds, who already had their minds biased against Donner. So no matter how much pressure was put on them to allow Donner making his film, this was not going to be possible. At the end of the day, nothing major was ever accomplished in terms of lobbying for a Donner cut of Superman 2. Everyone moved on to other projects. The Salkinds produced Superman 3 and then Supergirl, and Donner left to work on other projects. In the end, the Superman franchise would end up materially dead after the release of the fatal Superman 4, a film that also has an interesting story, but that can be left for another video. Many years would pass without hearing anything from the Donner cut of Superman 2. Superman 2 was released in theaters, however. Like any release in existence, the money factory doesn't end there. Plans began to release Superman 2 in physical format and in television broadcasts. Focusing on this second point, a common practice that was carried out at that time was to launch extended versions of movies in TV broadcasts, essentially to be able to capture the largest number of advertisements in the middle of the movie. This is how several extended versions of Superman 2 were released throughout the world, versions that are currently materially impossible to see since they have not been released by Warner Brothers. These versions, however, brought us a significant number of deleted scenes from both Donner and Lester. For example, Donner's scene of Superman destroying the Fortress of Solitude, or Lester's scene where Superman and Lois cook a souffle. While these versions cannot be viewed officially, multiple individuals recorded bootleg versions of the TV broadcasts. This brings us to the next point. In around 2004, the fans who were still waiting to see a Donner cut in the future decided to do a kind of test to see how high the interest was in a new version of Superman 2. This is why a version known as Superman 2 The Restored International Cut was created, a version that brings together all this material from TV broadcasts around the world, creating a version that recovers much of Richard Donner's deleted material. This version was seen by many people and generated a new wave of interest in seeing a Donner version of Superman 2. Despite this, and due to rights issues, Warner Brothers sent a cease and desist letter to the creator of this version. However, it didn't matter anymore. Interest had re-emerged, and it was a train that no one was going to stop. Other ways of expressing the desire to see a new version of Superman 2 were carried out, such as the sending of letters requesting the release of the Donner cut to the Warner Archive division of Warner Brothers. Warner Archive ended up answering one of these letters, mentioning that although there was interest in releasing a new version of Superman 2, there were numerous legal conflicts that prevented the release, in particular those related to Marlon Brando's estate and the use of his scenes of Superman 2. It was right at this point where a fundamental situation occurred for this film to happen. Warner Brothers was making Superman Returns, and the director of that film wanted to use archival material of Marlon Brando for the film. An agreement was reached between Warner Brothers and Brando's estate, authorizing the use of archival material. This event was fundamental, since Brando's material from Superman 2 could now be used without any problem. Michael Thau in 2001 was in charge of editing the special cut of Superman. In the process of creating this new version of Superman 1, Thau came across a lot of never-before-seen material from the second film, stored at the Warner Archives in England. It was at this precise moment that Thau and Warner's interest aroused in the sense of making a new version of Superman 2. Therefore, they began to collaborate from that moment on the creation of said new version. At first, however, Donner did not want to be involved in the film for several reasons. Firstly, Donner felt that the way he was filming at that time did not correspond to the way he was currently filming, so he would not be able to create a version that fit his wishes.
When I look at it now, I like it. I'm a little embarrassed by things, but I have to take myself back 25 years and see it, why I did it then and how I did it then, not knowing what I know now.
Another reason was the fact that, at the end of the day, he never finished filming Superman 2, and therefore, making a new version involved using material from Lester, an idea that did not appeal to him at all. The rebuilding process for Superman 2 began anyway in 2005, with Thau overseeing everything. The requests for a new version of Superman 2 to be released with Donner at the helm did not stop. Even Margot Kidder did her part by saying in an interview that there was another hidden Superman 2 that was better than the one released. Donner, after finishing his film 16 Blocks, finally began collaborating on the project. He was joined by his collaborator Tom Mankiewicz. John Williams was also approached to collaborate on a new soundtrack. However, he was busy making the music for Revenge of the Sith. So the decision was made to use the Superman 1 soundtrack in scenes where it fit thematically and visually. A lot of work had to be done to create this new cut. In the creative section, restoration of the material and visual effects. Firstly, the material found by Thau was in very varied conditions, from material that was in good condition to material that needed to be restored, since the dust in the environment damages the material. In the aspect of creative decisions, it had to be decided which Lester scenes should remain in order to make a coherent film. Some of these scenes that remained in the final Donner cut are the scenes at Niagara Falls, the villains in the town, much of the Battle of Metropolis, some scenes of Superman and Lois in the Fortress of Solitude, among others. It also had to be decided which ending to use, as mentioned earlier. Originally, the ending of Going Back in Time was the ending of Superman 2, but since it was the most spectacular scene of Superman 1 and 2, Warner Brothers and the Salkinds asked Donner to change the ending and have it used for Superman 1. And then when he returned to finish Superman 2, he could create another ending. Since that return never happened, and Lester took the film when creating the Donner cut, they had the option of using the ending that should always have been or using Lester's. Finally, a lot of work had to be done on the visual effects, from creating new effects to finalizing others, such as the escape of the villains from the Phantom Zone or certain shots of the battle in Metropolis. The Donner cut was finally released in November 2006, and at the time it was well received by critics and audiences, with many considering it superior to the theatrical release. There was a lot of joy in the air with the release. However, it is important to emphasize that the cut is incomplete. Some scenes that Donner would have liked to film were never filmed, even having to resort to test footage from when they were casting Lois Lane, since Donner considered that scene to be fundamental to the relationship between Clark and Lois. At the end of the day, it is very noticeable when watching the film that it was a construction that tried to get as close as possible to what Donner wanted to do, but at times failed in the attempt. Furthermore, in the desire to leave out as much of Richard Lester's footage as possible, a lot of material was sacrificed that would have elevated the film much more, such as the scenes with Lois and Clark in the fortress, some scenes with the villains in the town, among many others. Maybe one day we may see a version that brings together the best of both films, creating the definitive cut of Superman 2. Thanks for watching.